So the Institute for the Study of War had an interesting take on why Vladimir Putin won't actually demobilize even if a ceasefire or a peace is agreed to. And it has to do with veterans returning home. And while I completely agree with that stance, I don't think it goes far enough. So I'm going to talk about more of why exactly Vladimir Putin is probably not going to demobilize, even if he agrees in principle with whatever talks he has with Donald Trump or any other leader. So the reason is he finds himself in a predicament eerily reminiscent of the Soviet Union's quagmire in Afghanistan back in the 1980s. However, unlike Gorbachev, who ultimately withdrew Soviet forces in an attempt to save the collapsing USSR, Putin appears unwilling to demobilize his forces in Ukraine. Instead, he sustains the war effort, ensuring that Russia's attention remains fixated on the battlefield rather than its growing domestic crises. And I think he's learned from what happened to Gorbachev, in that Gorbachev pulled out from Afghanistan and it led to the collapse. Maybe he thinks doing the opposite is going to save the current Russian situation. So Putin's reluctance to scale back military operations is not just about Ukraine, it's about maintaining control over a fragile internal situation. Putin understands that wars are often easier to start than to end. Demobilization would not only acknowledge the limitations of Russia's military strategy, but would also unleash a wave of internal problems that have been suppressed by the war effort. As long as Russian troops remain engaged, Putin can justify draconian domestic policies, frame economic hardships as necessary sacrifices for national survival, and keep potential dissenters occupied, either at the front or silenced under wartime laws. If Putin were to announce a large-scale demobilization, the following issues would surface almost immediately. One of the greatest fears any authoritarian regime has is the return of soldiers who have been exposed to the harsh realities of war. Many Russian troops sent to Ukraine were poorly trained conscripts or mobilized civilians who had little choice but to fight. Unlike the highly motivated and well-equipped professional soldiers of Russia's elite forces, these men have experienced war in its most brutal and chaotic form. Upon returning home, these soldiers would bring with them first-hand knowledge of military failures, corruption, and the sheer futility of the war. Like Soviet veterans of Afghanistan, they could become a vocal and potentially destabilizing force. Russia is not prepared to handle large-scale reintegration of war veterans. Social services are already stretched thin and their budgets have been cut. And an influx of demobilized soldiers, many with physical injuries, PTSD, and grievances, would add pressure to an already struggling welfare system. By keeping these men at the front, Putin delays the inevitable reckoning with their dissatisfaction. Now, the Russian public is also a problem because they're already showing signs of war fatigue. When partial mobilization was announced in September of 2022, the backlash was immediate. Protests erupted in regions far from Moscow, where ethnic minorities bore the brunt of conscription and hundreds of thousands of men fled the country to avoid the draft. As long as Russia remains at war, Putin can demand unity and crack down on dissent under the guise of wartime necessity. Many of Russia's economic woes, rising inflation, labor shortages, and declining living standards can currently be blamed on Western sanctions and the supposed necessity of military spending. Once the war ends, people will expect economic improvements, and when those do not materialize, dissatisfaction will turn into unrest. And they're not going to materialize because Russia's wartime economy has suppressed its civil economy so heavily that some sort of return is just not likely in the span of time necessary to ward off an uprising. By sustaining the war effort, Putin ensures that these grievances and the problems that are being had can be justified as we need to sacrifice to defend Russia from NATO aggression. And while the Russian economy has avoided total collapse, it is far from stable. The war has fundamentally reshaped Russia's economic structure in ways that make demobilization a risky move. The military-industrial complex has absorbed much of Russia's economic activity, providing jobs and justifying massive government expenditures, but a sudden demobilization would flood the labor market with returning soldiers at a time when civilian industries are struggling, and there's really nothing to backfill the military-industrial complex in Russia, because no one wants Russian products outside of Russia, and even within Russia, they really don't want them that much. Russia is facing inflation, a declining workforce, and sanctions that restrict its access to high-tech goods and global financial systems. The war has masked some of these problems by shifting the economy to a permanent war footing, but ending the war could expose these weaknesses and force the government to confront them directly. Putin cannot afford this level of economic instability. By keeping the war active, he's postponing the reckoning that would follow a transition back to a peacetime economy. And Putin's inner circle is also pretty upset about this because they benefit from a strong economy. So they are far from unified at this point. And while his regime appears stable from the outside, there are deep divisions among political elites, military leaders, and oligarchs. We've seen this wheel of replacements continue to take place. The Wagner Group's mutiny in June of 2023 was a stark reminder that not everyone in the Kremlin is satisfied with how the war is being handled. But the war allows Putin to keep his elite factions preoccupied. Military leaders are focused on securing battlefield victories rather than challenging his authority, and war profiteers benefit from continued defense contracts. If the war were to end, powerful figures would begin jostling for influence over the future of Russia. Some might push for more aggressive stances against other countries, while others might advocate for de-escalation and a return to previous economic reforms. Putin's best option for maintaining control over all of this is not to address it at all. How do you do that? Just keep on fighting. And perhaps the most significant reason why Putin refuses to demobilize is the war provides the perfect justification for increased domestic repression. He has these expanded censorship arms and crackdowns. Wartime measures allow the Kremlin to silence critics, imprison opposition figures, and exert greater control over the media. Forcing young men into the military service removes potential protesters from the streets and ensures that working class Russians are too preoccupied with survival to organize against the government. Putin has effectively weaponized the war to maintain his grip on power. As long as Russia is engaged in existential struggles with the West, as framed by their state propaganda, opposition is branded as treasonous, economic hardships are deemed necessary sacrifices, and political alternatives are suppressed. For Putin, demobilization is not simply a military decision. It's a political gamble that could accelerate the very internal collapse he has spent decades working to prevent. The return of disillusioned veterans, economic instability, rising domestic opposition, elite infighting, and the loss of authoritarian control mechanisms all make ending the war a dangerous proposition. As long as Russia remains engaged in Ukraine, Putin can sustain the illusion of national unity, justify continued repression, and keep potential threats, both domestic and within his own government, at bay. The war may be costly, but in his view, it's far less costly than facing the consequences of bringing Russian troops home. Ultimately, the question is not whether Putin wants to end the war, but whether he can without triggering the very collapse he fears. And because of that, any talks we likely are to see between the Trump administration or anyone, whether it involves Ukraine, the European Union, it doesn't matter. It's all just going to be talk because Putin, as I said, cannot end this war without dire consequences to his administration and regime.